This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Disney Plus wants to know, are you ready? For Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts, The New Avengers, now streaming on Disney Plus.
Let's do this.
One of the best Marvel movies of all time is now streaming on Disney Plus.
Hey, you weren't listening to me.
I said Thunderbolts, The New Avengers is now streaming on Disney Plus.
Meet the New Avengers.
That's a cool name.
Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts, The New Avengers, rated PG-13, now streaming on, you guessed it, Disney Plus.
Go from sunny Melbourne to freezing Edinburgh firstly, and then slightly less cold Cambridge, but all good.
Well, a change is as good as a rest, they say, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about, because you're a fellow at the University of Melbourne, and you deal in literature, say 17th and 18th century literature, but also intellectual history. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please, Mark?
Yeah, so I mean, I mostly work on that point of intersection, where this is the history of ideas and literary history meet, where literature is used to popularize and transmit certain ideas, mostly political ideas. And yeah, I've worked on Defoe, the subject of this book, for quite a while, mostly editing his work and then writing a little about his literary works. But yeah, so much of what we do in English, especially those of us who work in the literature of the past, is historical. So yeah, there's quite a lot of crossover in my work.
Yeah, that makes sense to me because, when I think about it, obviously at university you get straight literature courses, and you can't really get fully behind the work unless you understand the society and the religion and the other issues, which, of course, we'll be talking about with the book. But, I mean, if you don't understand those contexts, it does change the way you read the literature, really, doesn't it?
Well, it limits it in a lot of ways. You can get some of the aesthetic aspects, you can get some of the the formal aspects. But even that, the more immersed you are in the society, the more the literature is going to speak to you, the better you're going to understand it. And I quite like that. It's kind of an intellectual puzzle of trying to inhabit the past in a certain way and think how they would think. It's quite fun to do intellectually, and yeah, it's fundamental to the methods that I use to engage with literature.
Yeah, of course, and that is also what's led us to A Spy Amongst Us, Daniel Defoe's
Absolutely.
Secret Service and the plot to end the Scottish independence.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the more I dug into the context of a writer I was working on, the more interested I became in an aspect of his life that was known, but not sort of prominent in a lot of accounts. And I try to bring that out by, fully detailing his Secret Service and his work as a spy.
Yeah, I know it's a fascinating book because I would say that it is slightly known, but it is certainly misunderstood, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole history of the Union is such a polarizing debate because it has such contemporary relevance for the future of the Union that, you get these sort of strident views on either side, and that shapes our view of what Defoe did during his time as a spy for the Union cause. My attempt as you said, as an Australian who's, unconnected from these debates, I'm as far away as you possibly can be, probably, unless I took up a research position at the University of Antarctica.
An honest broker.
Yeah, and honest broker. I mean, you do end up with sympathies, certainly, but I try to sort of make it reconstruct what he actually did to try and come to a better assessment of its effects and how that shapes, Scottish Union, but also how it shapes Defoe's career as well. Because, I am, as I said, a literary historian. I am interested in what this means for Defoe, the writer.
I suppose, an obvious question before we start properly, but I just wonder, I assume it's the literature. It's Moll Flanders, it's Robinson Crusoe, and of course Roxana that brought you to Defoe in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I encountered him. And yeah, it's Nick Seeger, Roxana, the Fortunate Mistress, and the more I delved into the literature, the more, just to get a purchase on it, I had to learn about his life. And his life was just so interesting. And I mean, I suppose I'm interested in, I'm drawn to biography a lot. I'm interested in the gossip. I'm interested in the intrigue. And with a character like Defoe, it's just present and rich and interesting. And that's what sort of turned me from straight literary critic to, yeah, oh, I might be able to be historian, biographer, do a couple of things as well. Hence the book.
Yeah, and you point out at one point in the book about Roxana, that the story, the first part of the story, reflects on Defoe's own life in terms of his relationship with his wife, and then the money they didn't have and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very difficult and I think probably wrong to do straight biographical readings of some of his novels.
Right.
But the more I delved into his life, like with that episode you're talking about, the more I saw, oh, okay, he is drawing on personal experience.
Yeah, it's clearly something he understands.
There's clearly something happening, and there's clearly some sort of reflected guilt or something that's happened to him during his very eventful life that makes these sort of 6 novels that we mostly remember him for. I mean, that is what he's remembered as Defoe, the novelist, as Defoe, one of the founders of the English novel. But that obscures what he did before then, because he wrote all the novels between 1719 and 1725, and he died in 1731. So it's really just like a concentrated 5-year span towards the end of his life. A longish, quite long life for the period, and a life that was packed with incident. So to just look at the novels is really only to get quite a partial picture of the man.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing is, I suppose, that you said in there that correspondence, and because you worked as associate editor on Defoe's correspondence, that it was that really gave you this opportunity to know the man well enough to write this book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, know him in a certain sense, because we have a lot, the main surviving aspect of his correspondence is that he wrote to Robert Harley, who was the Secretary of State, who was Defoe, the sort of spy master in this whole story. What we don't have, which I'm really desperate to get, was letters to his wife. We have letters about, we don't, letters to family members. Sort of the evidence there is a little bit more patchy, and that would have been nice to have, like, much more personal reflections to get into the man's mind, to see what he was feeling. But yeah, it was. I'd long known the story of Defoe the spy, and I'd wanted to write this for years. But it was working on the correspondence, going to the archives all around England and Scotland, looking at how he was paid, doing that sort of work with Nick Seeger, who was the editor-in-chief of the correspondence, and actually learning from him how to do this kind of archival work. Really is what gave me the material and the confidence to just, you know what, this is a good story. It's a fun story. I'd like to write it in a way that appeals beyond, the academic audience. Let's have this. I think it's a good general story. And that was the sort of motivation for the book.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you set it up for us then, in the sense that this is the beginning of the 18th century? Give us a little feel for the background in what's happening in England at the time and the relationship with Scotland. I mean, it's a big question, but
No, it's a big question, but yeah. So obviously, people will know that from 1603, with the accession of James VI and First, England and Scotland share a monarch, and from that point on, successive monarchs tried to unite them more comprehensively. So Scotland still had its own parliament, still had its own, legal system, still had its own institutions. And there'd been James I tried, there were attempts under William, there were all these attempts to try and make a more incorporative or comprehensive union between the two. And there were supporters of that on both sides. Scotland was proving to be quite a sort of geopolitical weak point for England. The big worry was that there would be a French-backed Jacobite invasion that could come from the north. And the worry turned out to be founded. There were a number of these invasions. So England wanted Scotland to be more under its banner. In the early decades of the 18th century, the big global conflict is the War of the Spanish Succession, which England is fighting on the sides of the Habsburgs against the Bourbon claimants to the Spanish throne. Basically, they don't want France to get control of Spain and its empire, because that would just give France a sort of complete global dominance, and the fear is a Catholic global dominance. So they don't want to have to use troops in Scotland. The troops need to be on the continent. And Scotland is at this point has had quite a difficult road agriculturally, economically, and even though they were attached to England as one kingdom, they didn't have the same rights of access to England's empire. There were a lot of restrictions on trade. So the Scots, or certain members of Scottish society, wanted access to England's empire. The geopolitical position of England and Scotland is quite interesting and complex because, there are factions in both countries that see an advantage to union. Obviously, there's opponents in both sides, and especially in Scotland, because what is the trade-off to this more comprehensive union? What are we giving up? And the worry is that they would give up a measure of their sovereignty. And that's basically the overarching picture. And in 1706, for the first time ever, they managed to cobble together, the commissioners in London from Scotland and from England, cobble together a union treaty. And the next step is to get that ratified by the Scottish Parliament and the English Parliament. And that's where Defoe is deployed. He is sent north pretty much with the treaty to make sure that the Scottish Parliament ratifies this treaty, essentially votes itself out of existence, brings them into the United Parliament of Great Britain. And it's a very intricate and contested negotiation. And a man of Defoe's skills was, as both an intelligence agent and a writer, was really quite useful to the English.
And I hope we can explore that as we go along, because the intricacy is something that comes out in the book. And I roughly had an idea of where we were going, but you open up all sorts of avenues that I hadn't thought about before by exploring this. But it isn't actually a biography of Defoe. You've made that clear. It also isn't really a history of the Act of Union. It's actually about this relationship between Defoe and Harley and Godolphin, Paterson, the men around him, and how they fit into this picture, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's good biographies of Defoe, Max Novak's, Paula Backshotter's. There's great, and also good histories of the Union on both sides of the debate. But what really interested me was the fact that people like Defoe and William Paterson, they are operating at this intermediate level between the principals, these secretaries of state, politicians, treasurers, and the people on the street. And they are this class of essentially paid political operatives, like we get in politics today. We see quite a lot of it in England, a lot of news of chiefs of staff being dismissed. These people are quite powerful, and I wanted to have a look at their role in this monumental legislative achievement, because so much of the work is done at that sub-level beneath the principals. And so much of the interest to me is how they relate to each other, the agents, but also how they relate to those making the decisions, how they sort of interact with popular opinion, those on the street. And that's the story I'm trying to tell. So I think it's more a group biography. You're right. Defoe is the principal character, the principal figure whose life I tell, but it's not cradle to grave. It's very much concentrated on the years he spent in Scotland and what he did, who he interacted with, and how that really shapes the emergence of the modern British state.
I think that's really important to explore, because, as you say, I mean, to put it in a modern context for people, if you look at the peace process in Ireland, everybody will remember the principal parties getting together, shaking hands, finally making agreements. But there's 20, 30 years of work that's gone into that beforehand, with people in small meetings, in back rooms, spies, all sorts of people, involved in that. And that's what you've got too, the nitty gritty here.
Yeah, and that history is sort of, Defoe even mentions it, that in one of his letters, that those, and another one of Harley's agents as well, that those were forgotten. The nature of Secret Service is that to be effective, it has to be to a degree secret. And no, Defoe was not the most discreet spy. And he preserves the record of this important, I mean, without which I wouldn't have been able to tell the story.
Right.
You're right. There is this sort of backroom deals, concerted negotiations, and then the principals come in and, shake the hands, take the credit. And that obscures quite a lot of the work. And the interest in the work is, who it affects and how it affects and what it does. That's really what drew me to thinking about, Defoe, Paterson, Ogilvy, all these spies and agents who did, a lot of the heavy lifting, let's be honest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. let's look at Defoe then in particular and start with the point where he's in Newgate, or
Mm-hmm.
how he gets to Newgate, because this is to do with a pamphlet that he produced called The Shortest Way with Dissenters. Tell us a little bit about that, and then how that leads to Harley picking up on him, actually.
Oh yeah, no. So that's the start of the story, is because Defoe, who was a Protestant dissenter, so someone whose religious or confessional affiliation was outside the bounds of the Anglican Communion. Defoe was a Presbyterian, which
Mm.
importantly later for the story is the dominant religion in Scotland, which is why he does so well there. But he was writing against, at the beginning of Queen Anne's reign, there's a sort of high church Tory push to penalize dissent in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
And Defoe writes this pamphlet, and as with a lot of his pamphlets, he writes it anonymously. And he apes or embodies the voice of a high church preacher. And in this pamphlet, he's basically calling for the extirpation, or really the cleansing of dissenters out of England. And it's, it's violent, and people agree with it. And then once it's exposed that Defoe is the author of this pamphlet, that he himself is a dissenter, the hoax is exposed, and those who have sort of been lured to the logical endpoints of their prejudices are quite embarrassed. So Defoe is charged with seditious libel, which is a very broad legal category. It's basically any writing that threatens the cohesion of the state, and so he's charged. He goes on the run. He does not want to go back to prison. He's been in prison for debt already at this stage in his life, and he goes on the run. And I trace his sort of fugitive life for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Then he is captured in Spitalfields, and he's taken to Newgate. And Newgate, at this point in its history, is utterly horrific. It's an appalling.
You can't imagine in a modern context anything like it.
No, it's just, I mean, reading the accounts was one of the most confronting aspects of the research of this book. And we see, again, another moment where this surfaces in Defoe's novels. In Moll Flanders, when she ends up in Newgate, she calls it an emblem of hell itself and the
Right.
antidote to it. And I think that's pretty much how Defoe experienced it. But while he's on the run and while he's in prison, he starts writing to everybody who could potentially help him. He writes to William Penn, the founder of the Pennsylvania colony, because Penn and his son did a lot of advocacy for prisoners and often intervened with people like Harley and Godolphin, the Lord Treasurer. And he writes to a man called William Paterson, who we primarily remember as one of the projectors, as sort of this man who's put forth the idea for the Bank of England, but he was also the key architect of Scotland's failed colony in Panama and Darien. And he writes to Paterson to say, well, Paterson, knowing that Paterson at this stage is doing a little bit of work for Harley, saying, would you please speak to Harley on my behalf? And the promise Defoe makes is, if you intervene on my behalf, I will only ever write about you, Harley, in positive terms.
Mm-hmm.
And the power of Defoe's pen has been well borne out. The Shortest Way with the Dissenters, caused massive controversy and persuaded people, even if it was sort of against the intent of what it was meant to do in some ways. So Paterson sits on this letter for a while. He and Defoe had been rivals, but he eventually passes it to Harley. And Harley also lets Defoe stew in prison and also allows him to be pilloried. That was the punishment.
Yes, right.
That. So he had three successive days in the pillory, which is, again, a really difficult punishment where the crowd could throw stones. You could really be injured or even killed in the pillory. But Defoe, before that, writes this hymn to the pillory, and it's distributed. And he manages to get the crowd on side as this happens. Again, Harley is getting more impressed by this writer, lets him stew. Defoe's returned to Newgate because part of the sentence is he has to find sureties for his good behavior, and it's beyond what the bankrupt Defoe can really afford. So Harley eventually does intercede on Defoe's behalf, and through a secret network using Defoe's friends and brother-in-law, manages to get him freed, pay for him, so that Defoe really only knows that Harley's done it. Everybody else thinks it's sort of Defoe's allies. And from that point on, for a number of years, Defoe is Harley's agent, writing on behalf of Harley. And
how much do we think then that it's because he believed in the cause, or that he owed Harley a debt?
I mean, it's really hard to disambiguate
Mm.
that. And one of the key sort of points of contention that Defoe has for himself is trying to justify Defoe, who's primarily Whiggish in his political beliefs. How do I then justify myself as I'm writing for Robert Harley's increasingly Tory government?
Mm.
Because Harley starts at as a moderate and gets increasingly Tory as things go on. Defoe's a problem with that, has issues with that. But I mean, in terms of the work he does in Scotland itself, Defoe was, before he works for Harley, believed that union was the right move. So in that, he's fairly
Right.
justified. But there's a deep insecurity with him in being perceived as a hack for bread. He does not want to be seen as having prostituted his pen for money. So it's a continual point of tension in his own life and with how literary history and history has seen him. Yeah.
Right. It also indicates how clever Harley was, because he
Yeah,
hasn't
absolutely.
chosen one of his own men in a sense. He's chosen somebody who'd be absolutely perfect to do the job. But what you made me realize was, with his dissenter background, with his opposition in a sense to the High Tory, it actually makes him much more useful as a spy, doesn't it?
Completely. And Harley is a ruthless pragmatist. I mean, the more I read of Harley and the more I read his correspondence, the more apparent it became what a clever political operator he really was. Just absolute. He was Speaker of the House of Commons first, an absolute master of parliamentary procedure,
Mm.
and very much the more power he gained, the more people who were willing to be his agents. And he's very good at turning, former Jacobites, French spies to his
Mm.
cause and using people, as you said, because these people are the ones who can actually access opposition networks, those who are
Right.
opposed to his causes. It's, if you only hire allies, then what are you going to do? You can only spy on allies in a sense. You're not going to have as much of a capacity to infiltrate and sabotage opposition actors from the inside. So yeah, no, he's very good at that. A lot of the agents he hires in Scotland were either Presbyterians or had Scottish background, so they could move a lot more fluently through society than people that the Scots would immediately identify as an English dog, as the phrase Defoe uses.
Right.
So yeah, no, he's an unbelievably clever political actor.
And one of the things that comes out, of course, as well with the pamphlets, and you mentioned the effect of this particular pamphlet, but it's part of Defoe's role, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what he does in Scotland. But one of the things is just how important these pamphlets are. I mean,
Mm,
they really are. Well, that they talk about stuff spreading on social media, how it is in the modern age. But these
yeah.
really are a crucial part of the century, aren't they?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, this is what's particularly good with Defoe, or particularly effective with Defoe, is the way that his work is distributed. So before he's sent to Scotland for Harley, he undertakes two tours,
Hmm.
essentially giving a political ordnance map, going to a lot of constituencies that return members to Parliament, getting a sense of the franchise in these communities, who's voting how, what are the local political mechanics, giving a post-mortem on the election, because the tours cross over the 1705 election,
Right.
and what's happened, who's manipulating the elections. But as he's doing that, he's also establishing a distribution network of dissenting preachers, of business people he'd been allies with, of all these people who can not just give him up to the minute intelligence of what's happening, but can actively spread his polemic and his
Hmm.
pamphlets. So he can, it's not just, publishing in London or Edinburgh and it filtering up and down. It's, quite an interesting network that's targeting and disseminating work, as you were saying, if you use the analogy of social media, of like, it's not hyper personalized algorithmic targeting, but it's pretty, for the 18th century,
Yeah, yeah.
pretty innovative to be able to distribute your work, locally. And Defoe is pretty good at writing to particular constituencies of people in Scotland, in England, and trying to target the distribution of that work. That way he sends pamphlets. He writes to Glasgow, and he makes sure that those pamphlets are distributed widely in Glasgow and its surrounds. It's political persuasion at the most targeted it can be at this particular point in history, I
Yeah.
think.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Because the other aspect is that he is actually acting as a spy in more direct ways.
Yes. And infiltrating, certain sub-parliamentary committees. So if the big sticking points for the union, the main two big sticking points, to summarize it a little bit too baldly, is religion
Yes, right.
and economics.
Mm.
And Defoe manages to get onto the committee that's calculating the equivalent, the one-off payment that England's going to make to Scotland to offset its higher tax burden and to compensate for the loss of Darien. And he's also manages to get a lot of contacts on the sort of the Kirk ministers who are, on this commission of the Church of Scotland. So he's managing to persuade people individually as well as at a more global or national level with his writing, or local level. So he's got persuading individual people, setting policy in a way that appeals or at least offsets popular opposition, because he's a policymaker there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of actual spies, also deputing agents into major opposition networks. He has John Pierce, who he sends west to infiltrate and denude the Hebronites, the sort of radical covenanting opposition, making sure that they don't join up with, Athol's Highland forces,
Right.
and splitting the opposition is key, because that allows the union to sort of pass through without the opposition uniting in a way that might have scuppered it.
Yeah.
So
In other words, the church could have interfered.
Church could have interfered. The church has, if we think about local networks, who better than the Presbyterian ministers who have in their presbyteries, pulpits? They have
Yes,
a captive
right.
audience. They are highly influential. And while the Kirk remained mostly opposed to the union, Defoe was part of a team of people, William Costaris and others, who prevented them taking a more active stance. Never, I don't think they ever got them to sort of be for union and promote union, but preventing them actively opposing it is
Yeah.
not nothing. It's a significant achievement in terms of intelligence.
And as you say, this is
Yeah.
something that goes regionally, because if you want to talk about the economics, it's Edinburgh.
Yeah.
But if you want to talk about the religion, he has to get round the country, and he has to have people going around the country in order to take the temperature and to find ways of also altering the mindset there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is. And yeah, I mean, Glasgow also is developing now economically as well.
Right.
So there's other parts. But yeah, you're right. It's an interesting dynamic because, he has to persuade those with power within Parliament and, help keep enough votes in the Scottish Parliament to make sure the Articles of the Union pass.
Mm-hmm.
And there isn't the franchise in this period is pretty limited, but that's not to say that the popular will doesn't have a political effect, because even if voting is not the mechanism, riots in the street, petitions,
Yes.
these are all going to affect how MPs vote. You don't want to be against I mean, there is considerable pressure, and there's been a lot of excellent research on the popular resistance to the union. Karen Bowie is a historian, and she's documented all these sort of how coordinated the opposition was
Right.
in sort of corralling and organizing popular opinion against the union. And so after reading her books and articles, I thought, well, then it can't just be a job of bribing parliamentarians. There's got to be some other thing at work. And
Yes,
I
I see
had
what you
the
mean.
sense that, well, this is one of Defoe's key contributions. Not just Defoe. Queensberry had his own team of writers, and
Yes.
Harley had other writers. But my way in as a literary historian is through Defoe. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, can we talk a little bit about then the economic side of it, which goes to the Company of Scotland and the Darien scheme, plays into the Act of Union?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so the loss of the Scottish colony at Darien, with Patterson, who'd gone out with the first expedition and lost his wife there, lost his best friend there, lost his child there. It's another disaster. So the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies, what their plan is based on Patterson's model is they want to have an entrepot. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's sort of a trading post on the Isthmus of Panama between, the Pacific and the Atlantic, not far from where the Panama Canal is today. So it would give Scotland access to a whole new ocean, but it would also allow Scotland to be the sort of trading point between, these massive empires, Spanish, French, English.
Right.
And originally Patterson's plan was for a British a joint English and Scottish venture in Darien. Um, this is under William III, and he does not want to get Spain offside at this point in the history. And so once he finds out about what's happening, reacts quite stridently against the colony. This before it's even set off, but when the company's still raising funds to go on an expedition. So it becomes only a Scottish venture, which in one way drives sort of Scottish patriotism and investment, but in another way is quite risky because it cuts them off from English support.
Yes, right.
The other thing is they chose a piece of land that Spain had laid claim to. It wasn't continually occupied by the Spanish, but it's really within the Spanish domain. So without English support, with Spanish resistance, with tropical disease, it's not for nothing that it's known as the Darien disaster. They lose, I think, close to 2,000 people, colonists there. But they also lose a whole lot of the money that's been invested across Scotland in this scheme. The other thing is that they lose the sort of promise of empire. Scotland wanted empire to sort of shake it out of economic doldrums, as it happened in England, as it happened in Spain and elsewhere, and they never get that. So they're sort of their path to economic development is cut off. So Scotland is in quite a perilous place, economically speaking.
So can we see this as sort of an East India Company, but the failure? I mean, I don't know if people get this, but I think for me the context of something like the East India Company is that it's like all the biggest companies we know now, but with an army.
Yeah. So, I mean, and William Dalrymple's books on this really have done an amazing job categorizing just how and making accessible just how powerful the East India Company was. So the East India Company is also a bit of a problem. They are opposed to the Darien venture. They don't want any other joint stock company in the British Isles rivaling them for dominance.
Right.
So they also help drive English opposition to the Darien Company as it becomes known. But yes, it is essentially what these companies are doing. They are merchants with forces behind them. So the Darien Company, they did take soldiers. The problem was they weren't powerful enough to establish what the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company did. They weren't powerful enough to establish and settle a colony, which is really then becomes the source of these companies' wealth, and it just feeds it in the same way as these huge multinational corporations. The more power they get, the more wealth they get, the more power they get. It's just this cycle. Yeah. But yeah, that never happens for the Darien Company, and because of that, Scotland's in a bad place economically.
Yeah, I mean, because this is a huge financial part of the Scottish economy at this time.
Absolutely, and the investors in it are across huge swathes of Scotland. Individual magnate families, it's the sort of royal burghs, corporations in the city, local networks and shires. They're all investing and hoping for a return on their investment. And when that doesn't happen, so much of Scotland's wealth has been sunk. And sunk because they don't have proper access to global trade via England. And that's one of the things that sort of union promises. Doesn't quite deliver, but promises, full access, with the exception of Asia, to England's trade, to sort of England's imperial trade.
Yeah, and there is, well, I was going to say there is a lot of resentment, of course, over this, but there is a particular incident involving the Worcester.
Yeah, so I mean, Worcester is a sort of independent trading vessel, but it becomes associated with England. It's an English one, so it's associated with the East India Company, and it comes back from a trading voyage to the Spice Coast, Malabar, and it is essentially the Scots seize it because it has to make land near Edinburgh because that's the ship is leaking, and the crew are tried for piracy. And it is seen as and I think quite legitimately, as a reaction against sort of, East India Company attacks on the sort of last remaining ships of the Darien Company. Who are trying their best to sort of do small trading ventures to keep things afloat before. And they tried and sentenced to death. Only 2, I think, are eventually executed, but it causes a major breach in relations between Scotland and England in 1704. on the eve of the treaty being negotiated a couple of years later. So yeah, I mean, what struck me a lot when writing this history is just how global. It's not the history of the Union is. It's not
Yes,
just
right.
England and Scotland. It's all their sort of colonial and imperial networks, but also it cannot be separated from the connections of both England and Scotland
Yes.
to France, to Holland, so it just ended up sprawling a lot more than I thought it would when I proposed the book.
No,
Yeah.
you make a good point though, because that's something that I don't know how much you would agree with this, but I mean, obviously everything that happens in the 18th century still reflects in the 21st century. It goes to where we are. But the issue of France and free trade and the fact that at that time, because war with France, England could not actually have a relationship with France, and that was very different for the Scots. And we know
Yeah.
about the Scottish relationship with Mary Queen of Scots and so on, that going back over time. But it does demonstrate how global this was.
Yeah, and absolutely, and that's one of the things that worries England is this quote unquote old alliance between France and Scotland. Because one of the drivers to union is to sort of lock down that Scotland's connection to sort of main foreign policy connection should be through England, where there are actually other options at the time, and the worry is that France would be one of them. But yeah, it did end up, and maybe it was just my ignorance starting off, but when I'm tracing all these networks, I was just quite intrigued by how far they actually extend across the world at this point. And I suppose, I don't know, maybe it's a contemporary bias, sort of a bias of the modern age. We think ours is the sort of the connected age. Or
Yes.
maybe that's just me, but actually, it goes way back. Connections are harder to establish and maintain, but they're there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're right. I wonder, because of course the thing is that the longer, I suppose, the more distance we have from something, the more we get a sort of a handed down picture, unless we actually investigate, unless we do look back in
Yeah.
detail and start to explore. Looking at the from the English perspective, or the Scottish perspective, of seeing this as an invasion rather than or a takeover rather than a union. That's one aspect that you could look at it. The other way around is that you could look at it from the point of view also that England to some extent, a defensive maneuver here.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm hopefully a dispassionate observer I don't even have any Scottish ancestry. I just enjoy this part of the world that I'm currently in now for another week at least. But yeah, I think because it's still in existence and because the union that is, and because it never achieved the stability that people like Defoe thought it would achieve. It is so contested. And some of that is, we see it from Defoe. Defoe makes the argument in both his pamphlets that he publishes in England and those that he then publishes in Scotland. He makes it from both sides of the argument a sort of a compact of mutual benefit is his way of, and because of that, when one side perceives that that benefit is slipping, that inevitably brings in contention and makes it sort of unstable. But yeah,
Right.
I don't think we can see it as an invasion because those with the power in Scotland agreed to it.
Yes,
So
right.
that's my argument against that. A defensive maneuver, yeah, in some ways it was. England and Scotland prior to this point had so many wars back and forth, so many battles. Not just that, so the Scots had supplied mercenary soldiers. That was one of their main exports to a lot of England's enemies in France and the continent. So the capacity to harness that is sort of an advanced defense. Yeah, I think the sort of dynamic we see is sometimes it was like a fait accompli. There was always going to be union, or it was an invasion, and the bribery and the sort of parcel of rogues in the nation sold Scottish sovereignty for English gold. But the story is way more complex than that. It's a really complex negotiation, and neither one of those overarching narratives, which are, as you said, informed by current politics and your current stance on the union, neither one of those, I think, has enough explanatory power for how it came to being. I tried to be even keeled, but I think it points my sympathy sort of show. And I think it's hard not to see this. It's hard not to see the Union in a post-Brexit environment, especially
Absolutely.
when so much of the argument for the pro-Union Scots and the pro-Union English was, if we join, Scotland will have access to parts of Europe and the world that it otherwise wouldn't have proper access to. And that is such a key driver to union. And then you think, well, what happens when there is when that is kind of cut off to a degree with policy and voting made primarily in England. So yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. Again, I've got no horse in this race. It's far from affecting me, but it's
no, but I mean, it doesn't matter what the argument is. You know, if you're smart, you want to see both sides to understand, and what you realize is that the picture is always somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, that there are points on each side which balance and checks and balances, if you like. Because one of the things is, I think there's a quote from Queensberry in the book, and it's where he says something about a happy conclusion. And my first thought was, you know, well, the one thing that we never got was a conclusion, and you never do get a conclusion, you know. And it led to 1715, it led to 1745, and it led, as you say, you know, to the kind of talk we can have around Brexit and so on now.
Brexit and it leads to devolution in 1999. It leads to a number of independence referenda. It's not. I think Queensberry thought it'd be a happy conclusion, but you know, Queensberry dies in 1712 before an attempted vote to undo the union by his former ally, the Earl of Mar. Before as you said, I mean, after the 1708 aborted Jacobite invasion, but before the way more successful 1715 Jacobite invasion. So, yeah, I think the hope for the pro-union Scots and for people like Harley and Defoe in England was that once union was solidified as a quasi-constitutional act, it would just become part of the legislative firmament. It would just be accepted. But it wasn't, you know, because it's the kind of legislative act that seeks to change the identity of those it governs, you know, to become the sort of pan-British. And that's a very difficult thing for law to do.
Yes.
And it never gets that kind of stability. Because it's sort of what ends up happening is once the act becomes law, the opposition finally has something to unite again around. You know, before they, you know, disagreed on the tactics to best prevent the union from happening. Once it happens, there's newfound impetus for, you know, radical Presbyterians and Jacobites to work in concert to a greater degree than they did before union, and that presents a huge problem. But yeah, as you said, it's just, you know, mutual benefit means continued negotiation, and I don't think they were ready for that. Queensberry certainly wasn't, but you know, wasn't there to see the worst of it. Defoe certainly wasn't ready for that. I don't think any of them really countenanced that aspect of it's sort of contested.
No, and to be fair, I mean, you could say that with an awful lot of situations in the world where people don't have that ability to forecast, and of course, we're not mind readers, or we're not, you know, we're not fortune tellers. But at the same time, you'd like to think that they would think things through more than they do, perhaps. And I mean, that's me on a hobby horse there, I suppose. It's just that the consequences of history, you know, tend to come from not thinking about where you go next, perhaps, let's say.
Absolutely, yeah.
Talking about Defoe, then, to be fair, to get back to your book, he could be a pessimistic reporter when it came to talking about what was going on, but actually he was pretty successful in what he did, in truth, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Godolphin says to Harley at one stage, you are getting too negative a picture of what's happening in Scotland. But he's not Harley's only informer, and I think he's an important perspective. In a lot of ways, he's a realist. The worry that Harley had when he just had, you know, the network of, he wrote to a number of Scottish MPs and magnates, and the worry that one of his early agents says to Harley is, these people want to show you that they're in control of Scottish politics. They will show you that they're in control just enough for you to lose it. So for Harley to be an effective manager of a place, you know, 2 weeks ride away, he needs to have as accurate a picture as possible. And he gets a lot of that from Defoe. He gets it from another one of his agents, David Fern, who was a Scottish advocate, who also gave a very, I mean, Defoe gives in a lot of ways a partisan picture. Fern gives a lot more straight down the middle picture of where things are. But Harley is reading multiple perspectives. I mean, that's what the good spy master does: is they gather intelligence from all their sources and they weigh it against
Right.
another. So that's how Harley gets a good picture of Scotland. Yeah, Defoe's efficacy is a big point of debate. And I don't have, if I had a smoking gun to show that, a decision he made or something he did, absolutely paved the way to union. I mean, great, I would have probably sold more books, but I can't do that as a,
No, I see what you mean, but how do you
yeah.
calculate the
How do you,
influence
yeah,
on
exactly.
people? Yeah.
Yeah, how do you calculate exactly? How do you calculate persuasive influence? It's
Mm.
pretty difficult. But I do think at key points he was part of a network, multiple overlapping networks of pro-union actors who, the union at a number of points could have collapsed. Either a clause added in the negotiations that would have been intolerable to the English, or an article not passed through, or a riot that went out of control and stopped, voting. There are a number of these key points. Um, and I think he's absolutely in the thick of it, making sure that it goes as smoothly as possible. His ultimate efficacy, I think he was pretty effective,
Mm.
but it's impossible to say with definitiveness. One action changed the course of history in this way. But the other thing where he's quite important is he writes the first history of the Union, which is
Right.
very important in sort of establishing, if we think that the continuation of the Union is an argument based not just on benefit, but also on, it keeps reverting back to origins. It's an argument that goes back to cause.
Mm.
And Defoe helps set the tone for the historiography of the Union. And I think that's a significant achievement in and of itself, with the spy, even putting the spy network aside.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. No, he does have that wider. It was again something that I picked up from reading the book was how much of a wider role he has. He's not just a spy.
No,
Uh,
he's a spy, he's a
um,
writer, he's a policy maker, he's a
yeah,
historian. He's, I mean, he has, I don't know where he gets the energy from. Just
but
the
it
sheer,
almost seems like he has well, okay, maybe unique is not the fair word, but he has a fairly original and distinctive role in the affairs in a way that most people don't, or most spies have never done.
yeah, I suppose. I mean, there is quite a lot of crossover between spies and novelists.
Mm. Yeah,
They are doing similar things. They're adopting a cover story. They're embodying the perspective of another. They are, one of Defoe's um, friends, John Francham, calls him an expert reader of mankind. And I think
right.
that's the skill you need as a novelist, but it's also this one of his sort of, as you said, one of the unique skills he has as a spy. He's able
Spy.
to read people in a certain way, and whether that shapes how he acts, and it does, and how he presents certain actors to Harley, and it does, is important. It's a kind of human intelligence that is pretty rare, especially in this earlier period. And that itself, I think, is fundamental to his achievements and his importance. And that's, if you're saying he's got a kind of role, I mean, just so many of his roles converge on that ability to read people. The writing he does, the
Mm.
spying, the talking to people in parliamentary subcommittees and in the alehouse. He's talking to regular people, not just to gain, to sample opinions, which he does. He's sort of an early inventor of opinion polling, but he does it in a way to also influence. It's not
Mm.
just neutral. He's never just neutrally gaining information and intelligence. He's always deploying it to shape people
Right.
in Harley's interest. Yeah.
Yeah, and that explains it. Yeah. What about just curious, have you been to Bun Hill? Have you seen the cemetery?
Yeah, I have. Not on this trip, but on previous ones, yeah.
It's curious though, isn't it? To come across this little cemetery and then suddenly realize how important it is.
Yeah, and a number of other like key dissenting figures
Yeah.
there as well. Yeah.
With John Bunyan for a start.
Yeah, Bunyan, yeah. Yeah, it's I mean, I'm not usually one who does like writers' graves as a sort of
Right.
tool thing, but that one was quite affecting, especially because I've um and when you write like a biography, you end up living in the thoughts of these people for so long
Right.
that it's like important to see where they lived and worked and died and buried and memorialized. Yeah, a lot of
Yeah.
Um, so I started this before the pandemic, and I did a lot of the research in Edinburgh and London. And thank goodness I sort of, to try and get into the mindset, I walked the streets and I traced where they'd been, which was necessary because then I ended up writing the bulk of the book in Melbourne without access to the streets. I had to sort of
Right.
rely on both what I'd written down in memories. And Richard Holmes, the sort of the great romantic biographer, in
Hmm.
his book Footsteps, he talks about these parallel books he keeps, one of facts and one of sort of feelings and sentiments. And experiences. And I tried to do that as much as I could with Defoe. Obviously, Defoe is not as expressive as the romantic poets that
Right.
Richard Holmes works on. He's a lot more austere in his expression of morality. But it's part of the biographic effort to sort of go to these places, and an important way to get into somebody's mind.
Yeah, no, I'm
Yeah,
sure it is. I mean, even though you work in documents for a living,
yeah,
you can put a picture to something in a way that you can't otherwise, can't you?
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just walking both Edinburgh and the areas of London which the book is centered on
Mm,
are still quite walkable, and still so much exists of the cities as they were when Defoe walked them, and that's quite special. To walk the
yeah.
city as he would have walked it in a way. He probably didn't stop at Pret for a sandwich halfway through his walk, uh, but yeah, it's still quite interesting and wonderful to sort of follow in his footsteps in a bit.
No,
Um,
it is. And I think then you can convey that a little bit in the book, because you're talking about the characters. You do get a sense of that. Um,
yeah, I mean that was the intention. Yeah, and I
yeah.
hope it came to fruition. Yeah.
So for you, this trip, is it academic or is it about, do you get an opportunity to promote the book?
Yeah, no, it's been a great. I mean, it's essentially two things because when I travel so far, I like to get as much in as
I'll
possible.
bet.
Especially since my partner, she's back at home with our 4-year-old, so like I've got quite limited time. So I had a wonderful book event in Edinburgh. I've just done one in Cambridge. I've got one in London on the 23rd at Waterstones in Hampstead. But also research for the next book. I've spent quite a lot of time in the National Library of Scotland and the British Library as well. So yeah, trying to fit everything in, probably come back completely exhausted and have to teach the following week. But that's the problem for future me.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
worry about that next week. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Any indications of what the next book is about, or is that something you like to keep tight?
No, I mean, I'd like to do I'm exploring my options. I'd like to do another biography.
Right.
I'm thinking maybe a biography of Crusoe, of Defoe's main character, but treating him
All right.
as the person who's had such an effect. Very few people have had such an effect on history as Crusoe the character. So I thought
Mm,
it'd be quite. And there've been a number of excellent biographies of literary characters. Marion Turner's Wife of Bath, Shelley Fisher Fishkin's Jim, from Huck Finn.
right.
So yeah, I'm thinking of that, but also looking at just doing some archival dives to see if there's another figure from this period, because now I'm feeling quite immersed that had a life I can tell in an
Yeah,
interesting
no, I can
way.
see that.
Yeah.
What about then? I mean, we've talked about a few books, and by the way, anything you've mentioned, I will make sure is in the notes so people can follow up if they
Oh,
want to look at that.
thanks.
But I was just thinking a recommendation, and it does not have to be a history book. It does not have to be a literary book. It can be anything you like. But is there
Hmm.
something you'd recommend to people? Something maybe you've read recently that you really enjoyed? I mean, I suppose as an academic and writing books like this, you must be immersed in the period and the history a lot, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, the books that sort of really affected me, and uh, the one that really got me to thinking about group biographies was Leo Damrosch's The Club, with
Right.
John Boswell. That one got me thinking, well, this is how you can tell an interconnected story. Same Jenny Oglow's The Lunar Men, the same sort of thing, the sort of
Yes. Right.
these sort of connected biographies. In terms of like the nonfiction book that I go back to so often, especially when I teach so much fiction.
Hmm.
So nonfiction I read as a sort of way to learn about the periods that I'm working in, but also to sort of learn the art of writing nonfiction. But the one I
Right.
continually go back to is King Leopold's Ghost, about the Belgian Congo, Adam
Right.
Hochschild. That one is just sort of in all my reading of sort of nonfiction. That's the one that steps out. Oh, and one final one, Phyllis Rose, Parallel Lives, where she tells the story of a number of marriages in the Victorian period. I thought that was the most unbelievable reconstruction of people's personal lives.
Right.
which is something I try to do to it. Defoe is hard because of the paucity of evidence, but I
Hmm.
try to do it to a greater extent than I felt had been done before. I don't know if I managed that, but that was the sort of book that made me think about it. That and pretty much anything Janet Malcolm has ever written.
Right. As I said, I
Sorry, you
will put
asked for
that
one
in there.
recommendation, I gave half a library, but
No, no, no. But it's always fascinating, and actually, you there's a few of those books I know. There's a couple I don't, and it'd be interesting for me to have a look then and see. And I think other people are the same. We're always interested in where people read and what they pick up on. But I will make sure that is in the program notes. But Mark, I've had a great time. Thank you very much.
no, thank you so much. That was really fun.